Merle Oberon didn't just hide her identity, she murdered it, burying a 14-year-old rape victim named Estelle Thompson under layers of Tasmanian fiction so convincing that she fooled the world for 68 years. When the truth finally emerged after her death in 1979, it revealed the most successful act of racial passing in Hollywood history, a performance so flawless that she became the first actress of South Asian descent to be nominated for an Academy Award while everyone believed she was white. But the woman who could transform herself from Bombay street child to British aristocrat on screen had paid for that transformation by becoming a prisoner of her own creation, trapped forever in a role that required her to deny every authentic part of herself. But was Merle Oberon a courageous survivor who used deception as her only weapon against systematic racism? Or was she a traitor to her own people who chose privilege over truth, abandoning her heritage for personal gain? Did she open doors for future actors of color by proving they could achieve mainstream success? Or did she reinforce the very system that demanded invisibility from non-white performers by demonstrating that success was only possible through complete self-erasure? The woman who graced magazine covers while denying her own reflection left behind a legacy that forces us to question whether survival and authenticity can ever coexist in systems designed to reward conformity. The mathematics of her deception defy comprehension. One birth certificate hidden, one fictional birthplace maintained, one grandmother transformed from mother to employer, one true identity sacrificed for 68 years of performance. She was simultaneously the most visible South Asian actress in Golden Age Hollywood and completely invisible as a South Asian person, celebrated for her exotic beauty while concealing its actual origins, honored for her British elegance while suppressing her colonial reality. For 4 decades, she was one of the world's most photographed women, and for 40 years after her death, she remained one of the world's most misunderstood. This is not the inspiring story of Hollywood diversity that modern audiences want to hear. This is the story of someone who discovered that the only way to succeed in a racist industry was to cease existing as who she actually was, who proved that beauty could unlock any door except the one that led back to her authentic self, who demonstrated that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not failing to achieve your dreams but achieving them at the cost of your soul. Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson entered the world on February 19, 1911. Not in the refined drawing rooms of Tasmania that she would later claim as her birthplace, but in the overcrowded charity ward of St. George's Hospital in Bombay, born to a 14-year-old mother who was herself the product of rape and colonial exploitation. The circumstances of her birth contained all the elements that would define her life. Violence disguised as normalcy, truth buried under convenient fiction, and the understanding that survival required the complete reconstruction of reality according to the preferences of those who held power. Charlotte Selby, the woman who would raise Estelle as her daughter while concealing their actual relationship, was a burgher from Ceylon whose mixed Sinhalese and European ancestry had already taught her the survival skills that colonial society demanded from people who didn't fit neatly into racial categories. Charlotte understood that ambiguous ethnicity was simultaneously an asset and a liability. It could provide access to opportunities denied to obviously non-European people, but it also required constant vigilance to maintain the fiction that such access was deserved rather than stolen. The man responsible for Estelle's existence, Arthur Terence O'Brien Thompson, was a Welsh mechanical engineer whose position with Indian Railways represented the kind of mid-level colonial authority that allowed ordinary British men to exercise extraordinary power over local populations. His relationship with Charlotte's daughter Constance was not romance, but rape, enabled by a system that treated non-European women as available for sexual exploitation by any European man who desired them regardless of age, consent, or consequences. Arthur Thompson's death from pneumonia on the Western Front in 1917 eliminated the only person who could have provided financial support for his daughter, But it also removed the primary witness to the circumstances of her birth, creating the possibility that Estelle's origins could be reconstructed according to more convenient narratives. Charlotte seized this opportunity to transform tragedy into possibility, deciding that Estelle would be raised as her daughter rather than her granddaughter, eliminating the scandal of teenage pregnancy while creating space for future identity manipulation. The Bombay where Estelle spent her earliest years was a city that functioned as a laboratory for racial hierarchy, where every aspect of daily life was organized around maintaining distinctions between rulers and ruled, Europeans and natives, legitimate and illegitimate children. The Anglo-Indian community to which Estelle belonged occupied a particularly precarious position in this system. Too European to be treated as native, too native to be accepted as European, useful to colonial administrators as intermediaries but always suspect because their very existence proved the instability of racial categories. The poverty that characterized Estelle's early childhood was not simply economic but psychological. She was growing up in a community that was systematically taught to despise everything that made them distinctive, to view their mixed ancestry as contamination rather than heritage, and to understand that success required the maximum possible distance from anything that might be identified as authentically Indian. The shabby flats where she lived with Charlotte were training grounds for self-denial, places where she learned that survival meant becoming someone else entirely. The move to Calcutta in 1917 represented Charlotte's strategic attempt to position Estelle for educational opportunities that might provide escape from the limitations that Anglo-Indian identity imposed, but it also exposed Estelle to new forms of discrimination that would shape her understanding of how race functioned in colonial society. La Martiniere, Calcutta, where Estelle was enrolled as a charity student, was an institution designed to produce British-educated administrators for the colonial bureaucracy. But it was also a place where racial hierarchies were enforced through systematic humiliation of students whose backgrounds didn't meet European standards. The bullying that Estelle experienced at La Martiniere was not random cruelty, but systematic education in racial hierarchy. Her classmates were teaching her the same lessons that colonial society taught everyone about the relationship between skin color and social value, the difference between legitimate and illegitimate identity, and the consequences of failing to conform to European standards of appearance and behavior. The decision to remove her from formal education and provide tutoring at home represented Charlotte's recognition that traditional educational institutions would never provide Estelle with the tools she needed to transcend her circumstances. But the home education that Estelle received from Charlotte was unlike any conventional curriculum. She was learning to observe and mimic the mannerisms, speech patterns, and cultural references that would allow her to pass as someone from a higher social class and more acceptable racial background. Charlotte was not just teaching her granddaughter academic subjects, but providing intensive training in identity transformation, preparing her for a life that would require constant performance of characteristics that didn't come naturally to someone from her actual background. The involvement with the Calcutta Amateur Dramatic Society represented Estelle's first experience of using performance as a tool for social advancement, discovering that audiences would accept her as characters that they would reject her as being in real life. The stage provided a laboratory for identity experimentation where she could test different personas, practice different accents, and develop the skills that would eventually allow her to convince the world that she was someone she had never been. The nightclub frequenting and film obsession that characterized Estelle's teenage years were not simply entertainment, but education. She was studying the mannerisms and presentation styles of women who had successfully transformed themselves from ordinary origins into objects of desire and admiration. Every movie she watched and every club she visited provided additional data about how femininity, glamour, and sophistication were constructed and performed by women who had achieved the kind of success that seemed impossible for someone from her background. The decision to leave India for London in 1928 represented more than geographical relocation. It was Estelle's declaration of independence from every aspect of her authentic identity. Her commitment to a life that would require the complete abandonment of her actual history in favor of whatever identity might prove most advantageous for achieving her ambitions. The woman who left Calcutta as Queenie Thompson was already planning to arrive in London as someone entirely different. The early years in London were characterized by the kind of grinding poverty and systematic rejection that would have defeated someone less committed to radical self-transformation, but they also provided Estelle with opportunities to test and refine the identity that she was constructing for herself. The work as a dance hall hostess at the Café de Paris was not just employment but training. She was learning to embody the kind of sophisticated European femininity that wealthy men found attractive while carefully concealing every aspect of her background that might compromise that attraction. The progression from nightclub hostess to film extra represented Estelle's growing understanding of how the entertainment industry functioned as a machine for transforming ordinary people into extraordinary fantasies, but it also revealed the extent to which such transformation required the complete suppression of anything that might be interpreted as authentically personal rather than professionally constructed. The casting calls she attended were auditions not just for film roles but for acceptance into a social class that had explicit racial requirements for membership. The encounter with Alexander Korda at London Films represented the moment when Estelle's years of preparation finally intersected with genuine opportunity. But it also marked the beginning of her collaboration in the systematic destruction of her authentic identity. Korda's decision to rename her Merle Oberon and provide her with a fictional Tasmanian background was not random creative choice but calculated marketing strategy designed to make her acceptable to audiences who would have rejected her if they had known her actual origins. The Tasmania story that Korda's publicists created for Merle was a masterpiece of strategic deception. It explained her exotic appearance while avoiding any suggestion of non-European ancestry, provided her with a suitably remote birthplace where documentation would be difficult to verify, and allowed her to maintain the sophisticated English accent that she had been perfecting for years, while suggesting aristocratic rather than colonial origins for her cultural sophistication. But the acceptance of this fictional identity also represented Merle's final commitment to a life that would require constant vigilance to maintain, where every interview, every social interaction, and every personal relationship would need to be carefully managed to prevent the emergence of information that might contradict the carefully constructed mythology that had become the foundation of her career. The woman who had been born as Estelle Thompson was dying so that Merle Oberon could live. The role of Anne Boleyn in The Private Life of Henry VIII represented Merle's breakthrough performance not just as an actress but as a racial impersonator. Audiences accepted her as the doomed queen without questioning whether someone who looked like her could authentically represent English royalty, proving that her transformation had been successful enough to fool even sophisticated viewers who were specifically looking for historical authenticity. The success of the film established Merle as a star, but it also trapped her permanently in the identity that had made that success possible. The move to Hollywood under contract with Samuel Goldwyn represented Merle's entry into an entertainment system that was even more rigidly segregated than the British film industry, where racial categories were enforced through systematic exclusion and where the consequences of being discovered as non-white would be immediate and permanent career destruction. The Motion Picture Production Code explicitly prohibited the portrayal of interracial relationships, and informal industry practices made it impossible for obviously non-European actors to play anything other than stereotypical ethnic roles. The nomination for Best Actress for The Dark Angel in 1936 represented Merle's ultimate triumph as a racial passer. She had become the first person of South Asian descent to be recognized by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. But she had achieved this recognition by convincing everyone that she was not of South Asian descent at all. The irony was complete. She had broken a racial barrier by denying that the barrier applied to her, achieving representation by making herself invisible. The nomination for Best Actress for The Dark Angel in 1936 represented Merle's ultimate triumph as a racial passer. She had become the first person of South Asian descent to be recognized by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. But she had achieved this recognition by convincing everyone that she was not of South Asian descent at all. The irony was complete. She had broken a racial barrier by denying that the barrier applied to her, achieving representation by making herself invisible. The Academy Award ceremony itself was a masterpiece of successful deception. Merle sat in the audience as nominee Merle Oberon from Tasmania, applauded by industry colleagues who had no idea they were witnessing a historic moment for South Asian representation in cinema. The nomination itself was revolutionary, but the revolution was invisible even to the person who had achieved it, buried so deeply under layers of fictional identity that its true significance would not be understood for decades. But the psychological cost of this achievement was immense. Merle was experiencing the ultimate validation of her professional skills while being forced to deny the identity that made that validation historically significant. She was being celebrated for becoming everything that her authentic self was supposedly incapable of becoming, creating a form of internal schism that would affect every subsequent moment of triumph in her career. The success of films like Wuthering Heights also established Merle as a prisoner of her own creation. The more famous she became, the more dangerous it became to reveal any aspect of her authentic identity, and the more resources other people had for investigating the inconsistencies in her official biography. The woman who played Kathy Earnshaw was performing not just the role of a character who was destroyed by love, but the role of someone whose entire existence was built on the systematic denial of everything that made her real. The on-set tensions with Laurence Olivier during Wuthering Heights revealed the extent to which Merle's perfectionism and control issues were manifestations of deeper anxieties about being discovered as fraudulent. Every criticism of her performance was potentially a threat to the carefully constructed identity that her career depended on, making professional collaboration fraught with dangers that her co-workers could never understand. Olivier's complaints about her professionalism were actually complaints about the psychological armor that she had developed to protect a secret that could destroy everything she had achieved. The car accident that scarred her face represented more than physical trauma. It was an attack on the beauty that had made her transformation possible, threatening to reveal the constructed nature of her perfection while providing her with legitimate reasons for the special lighting and makeup techniques that her racial passing had always required. The relationship with cinematographer Lucien Ballard that developed from their collaboration on Hiding Her Scars was built on shared understanding of how technology could be used to maintain useful fictions about identity and appearance. The multiple marriages that characterized Merle's personal life were complicated by the fact that each relationship required her to perform intimacy with people who only knew the fictional version of herself. Her romantic partners were falling in love with Merle Oberon from Tasmania, not with Estelle Thompson from Bombay, creating relationships that were simultaneously genuine and completely artificial. The inability to reveal her authentic background to even her closest companions created a form of isolation that no amount of professional success could alleviate. The adopted children from her marriage to Bruno Pagliai represented Merle's attempt to create family relationships that might provide unconditional love while also demonstrating the tragic irony that she was giving them the secure family identity that she had never possessed while preventing them from ever understanding the courage and sacrifice that their mother's success had required. She was providing them with everything she had never had while being unable to share the story of how she had achieved it. The gradual decline of her film career during the 1950s was not just the result of changing audience preferences, but the natural consequence of a performance that had become increasingly difficult to sustain as social attitudes began to shift and investigative journalism made comprehensive background deception more risky. the woman who had achieved success by perfectly embodying 1930s ideals of exotic beauty and sophisticated femininity, found herself trapped in an identity that was becoming anachronistic. The retreat from Hollywood to private life represented Merle's recognition that the persona she had created for herself was becoming impossible to maintain in an industry that was slowly beginning to acknowledge its own racial problems, and in a society where civil rights movements were making conversations about racial identity more complex and politically charged. The price of maintaining her deception was increasing while the benefits were decreasing, creating pressures that made withdrawal from public life seem like the safest strategy. The 1978 trip to Tasmania represented perhaps the most psychologically complex moment in Merle's entire life. She was finally visiting the place that she had claimed as her birthplace for 40 years, knowing that her presence there was simultaneously the culmination of her deception and a form of pilgrimage to a homeland that had never actually been hers. The illness that forced her to leave early was not just physical but psychological. She was confronting the impossibility of her own existence in the most literal way possible. The public denial at the Hobart reception, where Merle explicitly stated that she had not been born in Tasmania, represented the closest she ever came to truth-telling about her identity. But it also demonstrated the extent to which she remained trapped by circumstances that made complete honesty impossible, even when maintaining the lie had become psychologically unbearable. She was simultaneously confessing and concealing, revealing the falseness of one story while remaining unable to provide the true alternative. The death from stroke on November 23, 1979 in Malibu represented the end of one of the longest and most successful acts of racial passing in modern history. But it also marked the beginning of a posthumous investigation that would finally reveal the truth that Merle had spent her entire adult life concealing. The discovery of her birth certificate in Indian government records represented a form of archaeological excavation of identity. Researchers were literally digging up documents that proved the existence of someone who had been systematically erased from public record, revealing the gap between legal documentation and social reality that had made Merle's deception possible in the first place. The family members who emerged after her death, particularly her nephew Harry, who had tried unsuccessfully to contact her during her lifetime, represented the human cost of Merle's decision to abandon her authentic identity. She had not just hidden her own past, but had severed connections with people who might have provided the authentic relationships that her fictional life had made impossible to maintain. The revelation that Harry was actually her half-brother rather than her nephew demonstrated that Merle's family relationships had been even more complex and traumatic than anyone had suspected, suggesting that her decision to recreate herself completely may have been motivated not just by career ambitions, but by the need to escape from family circumstances that were psychologically unbearable. The posthumous biographies and documentaries that investigated Merle's life revealed the extent to which her story was representative of larger patterns of racial passing that had characterized the entertainment industry throughout the 20th century. But they also demonstrated the unique success that she had achieved in maintaining her deception for decades longer than most people who attempted similar identity transformations. The academic studies of Merle's career that emerged in the context of contemporary discussions about diversity and representation revealed the tragic irony that she had been a pioneering figure in breaking racial barriers while being completely invisible as a person who had actually broken those barriers, celebrated for achievements that were attributed to her fictional identity rather than her authentic background. The claims about her influence on contemporary discussions of identity and representation were complicated by the fact that her success had been built on the complete erasure of the identity that would have made her influence meaningful. She had proven that actors of South Asian descent could achieve mainstream success by convincing everyone that they were not of South Asian descent, creating a form of representation that was simultaneously groundbreaking and completely invisible. But the emergence of her story in the context of contemporary diversity initiatives also revealed the extent to which the entertainment industry had made little progress in creating conditions where actors from non-European backgrounds could achieve success without having to disguise or deny their actual identities. Merle's story was not just historical curiosity but continuing indictment of systems that still reward assimilation over authenticity. The art collection and jewelry that Merle left behind represented her successful accumulation of the material markers of the social class that her fictional identity had allowed her to access. But they also represented the tangible results of a lifetime spent purchasing acceptance through the systematic denial of everything that might have made her genuinely distinctive rather than conventionally appealing. The $1 million that she left to the motion picture country house and hospital represented her final attempt to contribute to the industry that had given her everything while requiring her to sacrifice her authentic self. But it also represented a form of payment for services that could never be adequately compensated. The entertainment that her life had provided to audiences who never knew they were watching someone perform her own existence. The television miniseries Queenie that was based on her life represented the transformation of her real experiences into fictional entertainment. But it also demonstrated the impossibility of creating an accurate portrayal of someone whose entire public existence had been built on systematic deception. The actors who played her were performing a performance, creating multiple layers of fiction that made authentic representation impossible. The continued references to Merle in contemporary discussions of racial passing and identity construction revealed the extent to which her story had become emblematic of larger questions about authenticity, survival, and the costs of success in racist systems, but they also demonstrated the tragic irony that she had become more visible as a symbol after her death than she had ever been as an authentic person during her lifetime. The museum exhibitions and academic conferences that featured her story represented attempts to preserve and interpret her experiences for educational purposes. But they also raised complicated questions about the ethics of discussing someone's hidden identity after their death, particularly when that person had spent their entire life working to prevent such discussions from occurring. The family members in India who continued to claim connection to her after her death represented the communities that she had been forced to abandon in order to achieve success, but they also represented the ongoing costs of her decision to disappear from their lives. People who had been denied the opportunity to know their famous relative because acknowledging that relationship would have destroyed the fiction that made her fame possible. In the end, Merle Oberon's story forces us to confront questions that have no comfortable answers. If you were born as Estelle Thompson, a mixed-race child of rape in colonial India, would you have chosen to murder that identity to live as Merle Oberon? Is survival through self-erasure a form of courage or cowardice? When systematic oppression offers you the choice between authenticity and success, is choosing success a betrayal of everyone who shares your background, or is it the smartest strategy for navigating an impossible situation? Did Merle Oberon open doors for future actors of color by proving that talent could transcend racial barriers? Or did she slam those doors shut by demonstrating that success was only possible through complete denial of non-white identity? Was she a pioneer who broke ground that others could later build upon? Or was she an enabler who made the system more comfortable with its own racism by providing the illusion of inclusion without the reality of acceptance? The woman who spent 68 years performing whiteness had succeeded so completely that she became invisible as a person of color even after her death, celebrated for achievements that were attributed to someone who had never actually existed, mourned by people who had never really known her. She had won everything that the entertainment industry could offer, but had she won it for herself or for the fictional character she had created to replace herself? Perhaps the most disturbing question that Merle Oberon's life raises is not whether her choices were right or wrong, but whether they should have been necessary at all. In a just world, would Estelle Thompson have been able to achieve the same success without becoming Merle Oberon? And if the answer is no, If systematic racism made such transformation the only path to success, then who bears responsibility for the psychological violence that such transformation required? The morning light that streams through Hollywood today illuminates a landscape where actors of South Asian descent can achieve success without hiding their backgrounds. But it also reveals an industry that still struggles with authentic representation, that still rewards assimilation over diversity, that still demands that actors of color prove their worthiness in ways that white actors never have to consider. Merle Oberon died without ever answering the question of whether she regretted her choices, whether she considered herself a success or a casualty, whether she believed her sacrifice had been worth the price she paid. But her silence on these subjects may be the most honest response to questions that have no satisfactory answers, to choices that should never have been required, to a life that proved both the possibility and the impossibility of transcending the circumstances of your birth. If you discovered tomorrow that you could achieve everything you've ever wanted, but only by completely erasing who you actually are, would you make the same choice that Estelle Thompson made in 1928? And if you wouldn't, if you believe that authenticity matters more than success, then what does that say about your willingness to judge someone who faced that choice when the stakes were survival rather than preference, when the alternative was not just professional failure but social invisibility and economic catastrophe? Merle Oberon's greatest performance was not any role she played on screen but the 70-year act of being someone she wasn't, proving that identity is both the most essential and the most disposable aspect of human existence, that we are simultaneously prisoners of who we are and architects of who we choose to become, and that sometimes the most successful life is the one that requires the complete destruction of the person who might have lived it authentically.